I never imagined my life would spiral into something so surreal, so utterly ridiculous, that I'd be here spilling my guts on the internet. But here I am, pouring out my humiliation to the faceless masses. My name's Daniel, I'm 36, and I've spent the last 10 years married to Julia, who I thought was my soulmate. Turns out, I was just another character in her little soap opera. Julia is the kind of woman who lights up a room. You know the type. Always laughing, always drawing attention, and always knowing how to charm her way out of trouble. I loved her for it. Hell, I still love her, even after what she did. I guess that makes me pathetic, doesn't it? But you don't spend a decade with someone without carving a piece of them into your soul. Everything seemed fine until last Thursday night. I was sitting on the couch, half watching some crime documentary while Julia tapped away on her phone. She'd been distracted lately, glued to her screen more than usual, but I chalked it up to work stress. She's in sales, which means constant emails, messages, and whatever else. But looking back, there were signs, little things I ignored because I trusted her. That night, she put her phone down and sat next to me, closer than usual. Her perfume was stronger, like she'd spritzed herself just to sit at home. That should have been my first clue. Dan, she started, her tone light but a little too rehearsed. Can we talk about something without you getting upset? My stomach sank. No conversation that starts like that ever leads anywhere good. Sure? I said cautiously. She took a deep breath, like she was about to ask for something outrageous, and boy, did she deliver. You know how I've been working with Mark a lot lately? Mark. The name hit me like a dart. I'd heard it in passing. He was her new coworker, apparently some hotshot regional manager who transferred to their branch a few months ago. Julia had mentioned him a few times, usually in a way that made me feel a little uneasy. Yeah, what about him? I asked, my voice already tight. Well, she hesitated, twirling a strand of her dark hair around her finger. He's been kind of flirty with me. And, don't freak out, it's nothing serious, but I've been thinking about something. Thinking about what? About us. About our relationship, she said, her words slow and deliberate, like she was testing the water before jumping in. We've been together a long time, and sometimes couples need to try new things to keep the spark alive. My mind was racing. Was she about to suggest what I thought she was? What are you saying, Julia? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. I'm saying, she continued, her tone unnervingly calm, that maybe we should explore some freedom, just for one night. Mark and I have this chemistry, and I think it might be good for us, for me, to see where it goes. Just one night, no strings attached, and then we can move on and be even stronger together. I stared at her, dumbfounded. Was this a prank? Was there a hidden camera somewhere? You're joking, I said, but my voice betrayed the fact that I knew she wasn't. No, Dan, I'm not, she said, leaning closer, her eyes pleading like she was asking for a weekend getaway, not a hall pass to cheat. I love you. I really do. But I need this. For me. For us. For us? The audacity of it made my blood boil. My wife, my Julia, was sitting here, looking me in the eye, and asking for permission to sleep with another man as if she were asking for a new pair of shoes. I stood up, needing to put some distance between us before I said something I'd regret. You're serious? I asked, pacing the room. Completely, she replied, her voice steady. Think about it, Dan. It's just one night. No strings, no consequences. And you'll see, it'll make things better between us. I'll come back to you, and we'll be stronger than ever. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that even surprised me. Stronger than ever? You think sleeping with Mark is going to fix our marriage? I think it's going to remind me of how much I appreciate you, she said, her tone infuriatingly matter-of-fact. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't the woman I married. Or maybe it was, and I'd just been too blind to see it all these years. Get out, I said finally, my voice shaking. Dan, don't be like that, out, I shouted, pointing to the door. She looked stunned, like she hadn't expected me to react this way. Fine, she said, grabbing her phone. I'll go. But you're overreacting. You'll see. And with that, she left. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, wondering how the hell my life had come to this. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The silence after Julia walked out was deafening. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, staring at the door she just slammed behind her. My mind raced, replaying her words over and over. I think it's going to remind me of how much I appreciate you. The sheer arrogance, the entitlement. It was like I didn't even know who she was anymore. I collapsed onto the couch, my body numb, but my mind spinning. What was I supposed to do now? Pretend this conversation didn't happen? Wait for her to come back after her one night with Mark and act like nothing had changed? Hell no. I grabbed my phone and stared at it, unsure of who to call. My best friend, Matt, came to mind immediately, but I hesitated. Matt wasn't exactly the subtle type. If I told him what Julia had just said, he'd probably drive over to Mark's office and punch him in the face. As tempting as that sounded, I needed to think this through. Instead, I opened my browser and started Googling. What do you even search for in a situation like this? Wife wants to cheat, but calls it freedom. Nothing helpful came up, just a bunch of generic relationship advice articles that made me want to scream. An hour passed, then two. I didn't move from the couch. The lasagna we'd eaten earlier sat cold on the kitchen counter, untouched. I thought about throwing it in the trash, but it felt symbolic of something. What? I wasn't sure. Then it hit me. If Julia wanted to play games, fine. Two could play at that. But I wasn't going to sit around and let her make me feel like a doormat. No, I was going to take control of the situation. The first step? Figuring out just how deep this thing with Mark went. I knew Julia kept her work emails on her phone, and she wasn't exactly cautious about leaving it lying around. Over the years, she trusted me enough to share her passcode, back when trust actually meant something. I also knew she synced her emails to her laptop, which she kept in her home office. I marched into the office, my heart pounding. Her laptop was sitting on the desk, exactly where she'd left it. I opened it and typed in her passcode. Bingo! Her inbox opened, and my stomach churned as I scrolled through her messages. There were dozens of emails from Mark, most of them work-related, at least on the surface. But the further I scrolled, the more casual they became. There was one from last week that made my blood run cold. Subject: Hey, can't stop thinking about the other night from Mark, Julia. I know we agreed to keep this between us, but I just have to say it. You were amazing. I've never felt that kind of connection before. It's like we've known each other forever. I can't wait for the next time. Let me know when you're ready. I sat back, my hands trembling. She'd already done it. The one night she'd so boldly asked for wasn't some future fantasy. It was a repeat performance of something she'd already done behind my back. I clenched my fists, the anger bubbling up in me like a volcano about to erupt. But I couldn't let it. Not yet. I needed to be smart about this. I took a deep breath and forwarded the email to myself, along with a few others that were equally damning. Then I went through her sent folder, and sure enough, there were replies to Mark that were just as incriminating. One stood out. Subject: Hey, can't stop thinking about the other night from Julia. Mark, you're sweet, but we need to be careful. Dan is, let's just say he wouldn't handle this well if he found out. I think I can convince him to give me a hall pass for the next time. He's too soft to say no. Too soft to say no. The words burned into my brain like acid. Was that how she saw me? Soft? A pushover? I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, my mind racing. It wasn't just about Julia anymore. It was about me, about reclaiming my dignity, my self-respect. If she thought I was soft, I'd show her just how wrong she was. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that email. Too soft to say no. Those words replayed in my head like a broken record, and each time, they cut deeper. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the sheer disrespect. I wasn't just a husband to her anymore. I was a convenience, a placeholder while she pursued whatever thrill her twisted mind came up with. By morning, the anger had morphed into something sharper. I wasn't just furious, I was determined. If Julia thought I was soft, then I'd make her regret underestimating me. But I couldn't act out of pure emotion. I needed a plan, something precise, something she'd never see coming. The first thing I did was call in sick to work. I wasn't in the right headspace to deal with spreadsheets and deadlines. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, laying out my next steps. Step 1 was easy: gather evidence. The emails I'd already forwarded were enough to expose her, but I needed more. Julia was smart, but she wasn't careful. Her social media accounts were linked to our shared computer, and sure enough, a quick search revealed a string of private messages between her and Mark. The messages weren't as explicit as the emails, but they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. There were inside jokes, flirtatious emojis, and casual mentions of their meetings that clearly weren't work-related. One message stood out, sent just a day before she'd asked for her so-called hall pass. "Can't wait to see you again. Let's make it even more memorable this time." Winky face. She was planning to do it again. Right under my nose. Step 2 was trickier. Stay calm. I couldn't let Julia know I was onto her. Not yet. If she suspected anything, she'd try to cover her tracks or twist the narrative. I needed her to think everything was fine, so I could control the situation on my terms. When she came home that evening, she acted like nothing had happened. She breezed through the door, a shopping bag in one hand and her phone in the other, chatting with someone. Probably Mark. "Hey, Dan," she said, barely glancing at me as she kicked off her shoes. "Feeling better?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just a little under the weather. Nothing serious." "Good," she said, dumping her bag on the couch. "I was thinking we could order takeout tonight. I'm too tired to cook." Classic Julia, always about convenience. I agreed, playing the part of the oblivious husband, while inside, I was seething. Over dinner, she was unusually chatty, talking about work and some new project she was working on. She even mentioned Mark, casually dropping his name as if it didn't make my skin crawl. "Mark thinks we should pitch a bigger campaign next quarter," she said, twirling her fork in her spaghetti. "He's got such great ideas. He's really sharp, you know?" I bit my tongue, nodding along like a fool. Let her talk. Let her dig her own grave. That night, while she showered, I checked her phone. She'd been careful enough to delete her messages with Mark, but her calendar told a different story. There was an entry for the following Friday: dinner with M. 7 p.m., Hotel Bellevue. A hotel? She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Step 3, take control. I knew confronting her outright wouldn't work. She'd twist the story, gaslight me, make me feel like I was overreacting. No, I needed to hit her where it hurt, the perfect mix of exposure and consequences. I started small. The next morning, while she was getting ready for work, I accidentally knocked her phone off the counter, cracking the screen. She was furious, of course, but I played it off as clumsiness. It wasn't much, but it gave me a small sense of satisfaction. That day, I called a lawyer. I didn't want to jump to divorce just yet. I needed to know my options. The attorney was blunt but professional, walking me through the steps to protect myself financially and legally. "Do you have evidence of the affair?" he asked. "Plenty," I said. "Good. Document everything. And whatever you do, don't let her know you're planning anything." By the time Julia came home that evening, I had a clearer picture of what I needed to do. I greeted her with the same forced smile, pretending everything was fine. She didn't suspect a thing. "Dan," she said after dinner, her tone unusually serious, "have you thought about what we talked about?" It took me a moment to realize what she meant, her request for a night with Mark. The sheer audacity of it almost made me laugh. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I've been thinking about it." "And?" she asked, her eyes lighting up with anticipation. I paused, pretending to consider my words carefully. "If it's really that important to you, then fine. Do what you need to do." Her jaw dropped, and for a moment, she looked genuinely surprised. Maybe she'd expected me to put up more of a fight. "Really?" she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Really?" I said, forcing a smile. "But just remember, actions have consequences." She laughed, brushing off my comment like it was a joke. "You're the best, Dan. I promise you won't regret this." Oh, Julia, if only you knew. I could barely sleep after that conversation. Letting her think I'd agreed to her insane arrangement felt like handing over my pride on a silver platter. But I knew this was the calm before the storm. I had to play my part perfectly to make sure she didn't see the tidal wave coming her way. The next few days passed in a surreal blur. Julia was in an unusually good mood, humming to herself as she got ready for work, her phone constantly buzzing with notifications. She didn't even bother hiding her excitement. Her glowing face told me everything I needed to know. Meanwhile, I worked quietly in the background. The emails, the calendar entry, the messages I'd found. I compiled them all into a neat little folder, backing them up on multiple devices just in case. Every smile she flashed my way, every cheerful remark, only added fuel to the fire simmering inside me. Friday finally arrived. The day of her big date. I pretended it was just another day, waking up early, making coffee, and heading to work as if nothing was out of the ordinary. When I got home that evening, Julia was already halfway through her routine. She was standing in front of the mirror, curling her hair, her makeup carefully applied to highlight every feature. She'd even bought a new dress, something sleek and black that clung to her body in all the ways she knew would turn heads. "Hot date?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She turned to me, her expression smug but playful. "You could say that. Don't worry, Dan. I'll be back before you know it." I nodded, pretending to accept her lies like the fool she thought I was. "Have fun." "Oh, I will," she said with a wink. And with that, she was gone. The moment the door closed behind her, I sprang into action. I had already booked a room at the same hotel, Hotel Bellevue, the one she had so graciously marked on her calendar. I'd chosen a room with a view of the main entrance, knowing I'd have the perfect vantage point to watch the night unfold. I arrived at the hotel about 30 minutes after Julia left, parking my car a block away and walking in through the side entrance. The staff barely glanced at me as I checked in, my simple attire blending in with the usual flow of guests. Once I was in my room, I positioned myself near the window, my phone in hand, ready to document everything. It wasn't long before I saw her. Julia stepped out of a car, her arm linked with Mark's, her laugh echoing faintly even from where I stood. I snapped a few photos as they walked inside, his hand resting on the small of her back. They looked like a couple out of a romantic movie, except I was the guy sitting in the audience, watching his life implode in real time. They disappeared into the lobby, and I waited. My heart was pounding, my thoughts racing as I debated my next move. Confront them? Expose them? No, it wasn't time yet. This wasn't just about catching her in the act. This was about making sure she couldn't worm her way out of it. About 20 minutes later, I saw them again, this time heading toward one of the elevators. Mark was holding her hand, and Julia was looking up at him like he was the king of the world. I took another photo, the timestamp burned into my mind. As the elevator doors closed behind them, I felt a mix of fury and resolve. I knew where they were going, and I knew what they were planning. But what they didn't know was that I had already called in a favor from someone who worked security at the hotel. Earlier in the week, I'd reached out to an old acquaintance, someone who owed me a favor from years back. He worked night shifts at the hotel, monitoring cameras and dealing with the occasional rowdy guest. When I explained my situation, he didn't hesitate. "Just tell me when," he said. Now is that time. I sent him a quick text. "They're here. Room 1407. His reply came almost instantly. "Got it?" My heart raced as I waited, imagining the chaos about to unfold. But I wasn't done yet. I had one final card to play, one that would make sure Julia and Mark would never forget this night. I left my room, making my way down the hall toward the lobby. My hands were shaking, but I kept my composure, blending in with the crowd as I approached the front desk. "Excuse me," I said to the clerk, keeping my voice steady. I'm supposed to meet someone in room 1407, but I think I left my phone in the car. Can you call up and let them know I'll be right back? The clerk hesitated, but my casual demeanor seemed to convince her. Sure, just a moment. She picked up the phone and dialed, her voice polite as she said, Hello, this is the front desk. We have a guest here who… I didn't stick around to hear the rest. Instead, I stepped back into the shadows, waiting to see what would happen next. Less than 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and out came Julia and Mark, looking confused and slightly annoyed. They walked to the front desk, Julia glancing around nervously as Mark tried to play it cool. That's when I stepped forward, my phone in hand, the photos and messages ready to go. Hey, Julia, I said, my voice cold. Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Mark looked between us, clueless but clearly uncomfortable. What are you doing here? Julia stammered. Oh, I just thought I'd check in on my wife, I said, holding up my phone so she could see the photos I'd taken. Looks like you've been busy. Julia's face drained of all color as her eyes darted between my phone and Mark. It was as if her brain short-circuited, trying to process how I had managed to show up at the exact time and place of her little rendezvous. Mark, on the other hand, was frozen in place, looking like a deer caught in headlights. He wasn't the confident, smooth-talking charmer she had described in her texts. He was just another guy who realized he'd bitten off more than he could chew. Dan, Julia began, her voice shaky, this isn't what it looks like. I let out a laugh, one of those bitter, humorless laughs that come when you're too angry to even find the situation ridiculous anymore. Oh, it's not? So you didn't just walk in here with your coworker, book a room, and plan to cheat on me? Because that's exactly what it looks like, Julia. Mark tried to step in, raising his hands in a weak attempt to defuse the situation. Look, man, I think we should all just calm down. Shut up, Mark, I snapped, cutting him off. This has nothing to do with you. Yet. The coward took a step back, clearly realizing he wasn't equipped to handle this. Good. My focus was on Julia now, and she knew she had nowhere to run. Dan, please, let me explain, she said, her voice desperate. I wasn't going to actually do anything. I just needed to talk to him about work, that's all. I raised an eyebrow, holding up my phone to display the damning texts and emails I'd compiled over the past week. Oh, really? Because these don't look like work messages, Julia. Want to try again? Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked at Mark for help, but he just shrugged, clearly unwilling to dig himself into a deeper hole. Let me guess, I said, my voice cold. You were going to come back to me afterward, tell me how much you appreciate me, and pretend like none of this ever happened, right? That was the plan? Julia's silence was answer enough. You know, I continued, my voice rising. When you first asked me for a hall pass, I thought it was the most disrespectful thing I'd ever heard, but now I see that was just the tip of the iceberg. You didn't ask for permission because you wanted to spice things up. You asked because you'd already done it, and you thought I was too stupid to figure it out. At this point, the commotion had started to draw attention. A few hotel guests paused to watch, whispering to each other as they tried to piece together what was happening. Julia noticed too, her eyes darting nervously toward the growing crowd. Dan, can we please not do this here? She hissed, her voice low but urgent. Let's go somewhere private and talk about this like adults. Private? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh, now you want privacy? Funny, you didn't seem to care about privacy when you were making plans to meet your little boyfriend here. I turned to Mark, who was now visibly sweating. And you, I said, jabbing a finger in his direction. Did you honestly think you could sleep with another man's wife and walk away unscathed? Is this some kind of sport for you? Or did you just assume I was too soft to do anything about it? Mark stammered something unintelligible, but I didn't wait to hear his excuse. Instead, I pulled out my final card. You know, Julia, I said, my voice calm but deadly. I thought long and hard about how to handle this, and I realized something. You think you've got all the power in this relationship. You think you can walk all over me, and I'll just take it. But here's the thing. I'm done being the nice guy. You wanted freedom? Fine. You've got it. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, handing it to her. She looked at it warily before opening it, her hands trembling as she pulled out the contents. Divorce papers. Consider this my answer to your request, I said. You want Mark? You can have him. But don't expect to come crawling back to me when he gets bored and moves on to the next woman in the office. The crowd around us gasped, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Julia stared at the papers, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. Dan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You don't mean this. We can fix this. Please, let's just go home and talk. Fix this. I repeated, my voice rising again. There's nothing to fix, Julia. You broke us the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you. And I'm not going to waste another second of my life trying to hold together something you clearly don't value. With that, I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her and Mark standing there in stunned silence. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me like a wave, washing away the suffocating anger that had been building inside me for days. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. But this wasn't over. Not yet. I had one more move to make, and it was going to ensure that Julia and Mark would never forget the consequences of their actions. I walked away from the hotel, my heart pounding, but not from nerves. No, it was something else. A strange sense of relief, even satisfaction, washed over me. For once, I wasn't the passive guy, the pushover. Julia thought she could manipulate me, make me a spectator in my own life, but I'd taken back control. But I wasn't done yet. As I drove home, my mind raced with the next steps. The divorce papers were just the beginning. Julia had made it clear she thought she could play me, but she was about to learn the hard way that I wasn't as soft as she believed. When I got home, I went straight to work. I'd spent the last week quietly preparing for this, and now it was time to put my plan into motion. I logged into our shared bank account and transferred all the funds from our joint savings into my personal account. Money I'd earned, by the way, not a dime of hers. I'd spoken to my lawyer about this, and he assured me it was perfectly legal, especially given the circumstances. Next, I changed the locks. It was petty, sure, but I wasn't about to let her waltz back into my house after what she'd done. The locksmith didn't ask any questions as he worked, and I didn't offer any explanations. By the time Julia called me, I was ready. My phone buzzed, her name lighting up the screen. I took a deep breath before answering, keeping my tone calm. Dan, she said, her voice panicked. Where are you? We need to talk. I'm serious. I'm at home, I replied flatly. Good, she said, relief creeping into her tone. I'm on my way. We need to fix this. You're not coming here, Julia, I interrupted. There was a pause. What are you talking about? Dan, this is my house too. Not anymore, I said. I've already started the divorce process. And if you think for 1 second I'm going to let you walk back in here like nothing happened, you're even more delusional than I thought. Dan, please, she said, her voice cracking. You're blowing this out of proportion. I made a mistake, okay? But we can work through this. Don't throw everything away. I laughed bitterly. You mean like how you threw away our marriage when you decided Mark was worth more to you than I was? Sorry, Julia, but you don't get to have it both ways. I hung up before she could respond, her pleas ringing hollow in my ears. The next morning, the real fireworks began. Julia showed up at the house, pounding on the door and shouting my name. I watched her through the peephole, her face red with frustration. Dan, open the door. This is ridiculous. I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled out my phone and recorded her meltdown, just in case I needed it later. She pounded on the door for a few more minutes before finally giving up, storming back to her car in a huff. The text came next. Dan, please, let's talk. I'm sorry. This isn't fair. You can't just lock me out like this. You're being immature. Be a man and face me. I ignored every single one. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, Mark decided to throw his hat into the ring. That afternoon, I got a text from an unknown number. Hey, Dan. It's Mark. I think we should talk man to man. Man to man? The audacity. I didn't even bother replying. Instead, I forwarded the message to my lawyer, who had already warned me that Julia and Mark might try to manipulate the situation. Stay calm, he'd said. Let them dig their own graves. By the end of the day, Julia had stopped texting. The silence was almost eerie, but I wasn't fooled. She was too calculating to give up this easily. Sure enough, the next morning brought a new twist. I woke up to find my phone flooded with messages from her friends, her family, even a couple of mutual acquaintances. Dan, what's going on? Julia says you locked her out? Hey man, Julia's really upset. Maybe you should hear her out. Dan, I heard you're divorcing Julia. Is that true? She's devastated. She was trying to play the victim, spinning the narrative to make herself look like the wounded party. It was infuriating, but also predictable. I decided to get ahead of it. I sent a single message to the people who had reached out. I appreciate your concern, but this is a private matter. I'll just say this. Julia made her choices, and now she has to deal with the consequences. Most people left it at that, though a few pressed for details. I didn't respond. Let them wonder. The final nail in the coffin came that evening. I got a call from my lawyer, who had just received a letter from Julia's attorney. Apparently, she was contesting the divorce, claiming I had no grounds to lock her out or take control of our finances. She's trying to paint you as the bad guy, my lawyer said. But don't worry. With the evidence you've gathered, we're in a strong position. Just keep documenting everything. Believe me, I said, I've got plenty more where that came from. As I hung up, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Julia had underestimated me, but now she was realizing just how wrong she'd been. And the best part? I wasn't even done yet. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Julia had underestimated just how far I was willing to go to make sure her betrayal didn't go unnoticed. If she wanted to play the victim, I was more than happy to shine a light on the truth. Cold, hard, undeniable facts that no amount of crocodile tears could erase. My first move was simple but effective. I uploaded the damning evidence, screenshots of her texts, emails, and even the photos from that night at the hotel, into a secure online drive. Then I drafted a single, carefully worded email to her closest friends and family, as well as a few of our mutual acquaintances. The subject line was blunt. The truth about Julia. I kept the message short and factual. To those of you who have reached out, I appreciate your concern. However, it seems Julia has been spreading a version of events that doesn't align with reality. I think it's only fair that you know the truth. Attached are documents and images that explain my decision to file for divorce. I'll let the evidence speak for itself. I hit send and sat back, my heart racing as I imagined the fallout. Julia had built her life around her image. Charming, successful, the perfect wife. But that image was about to shatter, and there was no one to blame but herself. Within hours, my phone started blowing up. Some messages were supportive, others were awkwardly neutral, and a few were outright furious. Mostly from Julia's closest friends, who were clearly scrambling to defend her. Dan, this is so petty. Couldn't you keep this private? Wow, I didn't know Julia was capable of this. I'm so sorry. Is this some kind of joke? I can't believe she'd do this to you. But the most satisfying response came from her mother. Julia's mom, Carol, had always been a tough woman. Sharp-tongued, no-nonsense, and fiercely protective of her family's reputation. She called me late that evening, her voice a mix of disbelief and anger. Dan, she said, skipping any pleasantries. Is this true? Did Julia really do all this? It's all there in the email, Carol, I said calmly. I wish it weren't true, but I couldn't keep quiet while she painted me as the bad guy. There was a long pause. I don't even know what to say. She told me you were being unreasonable, that you overreacted to a harmless flirtation. A harmless flirtation doesn't involve hotel rooms and secret texts, does it? I replied, my voice sharp. Carol sighed heavily. No, it doesn't. I don't know what's gotten into her, but you have every right to be angry. I'll talk to her. Thanks, Carol, I said, surprised by her response. I appreciate it. The next morning, the consequences of my email became painfully clear for Julia. I knew because she showed up at the house again, pounding on the door like a woman possessed. Dan, open the damn door, she screamed. I stood just out of sight, letting her stew for a moment before finally opening it. What do you want, Julia? I asked, my tone cold and detached. Her face was a mix of fury and desperation. What the hell is wrong with you? You emailed everyone? My friends, my family? You've humiliated me. Humiliated you? I repeated, laughing bitterly. I think you managed that all on your own, Julia. All I did was make sure people knew the truth. This is cruel, Dan, she said, her voice trembling. You're destroying my life. Funny, I said, crossing my arms. I thought you were doing just fine destroying mine. For a moment, she looked like she might cry, but then her expression hardened. You're going to regret this, she spat. You think you're so righteous, but you're just being vindictive. People will see through you. Maybe, I said with a shrug, but at least I'm not the one sneaking around behind my spouse's back and lying about it. She stormed off, slamming the car door so hard I thought it might break. I watched her drive away, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. She could be as angry as she wanted, but the damage was done. Later that afternoon, I got a text from Mark. Dan, can we talk? I think we can resolve this like adults. I stared at the message, incredulous. The nerve of this guy, trying to position himself as the voice of reason after everything he'd done. I ignored him, of course. The last thing I wanted was to waste my energy on him. But Mark wasn't the only one reaching out. One of Julia's coworkers, someone I barely knew, sent me a message that made my blood run cold. Hey Dan, I don't want to get involved, but you should know Mark has a reputation for this kind of thing. Julia's not the first married woman he's gone after. He's been warned before, but he's good at covering his tracks. Just thought you should know. I stared at the message, my mind racing. Mark wasn't just some random guy who got caught up in a bad decision. He was a serial homewrecker. An idea began to form in my mind, one that made my heart pound with a mix of anger and excitement. If Mark thought he could keep skating through life, leaving destruction in his wake, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Mark had slithered his way into my life like a snake, charming his way into Julia's affections while playing the role of a nice guy at the office. But now, knowing he had a history of going after married women, my anger hit a boiling point. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every family he'd ruined, every person who trusted him only to be betrayed. If Julia wanted to throw away her life, fine. But Mark wasn't walking away from this unscathed. The message from Julia's coworker was a gift, a thread that I could pull to unravel the carefully constructed facade Mark had built. I responded with a simple question. What do you mean by a reputation? Can you give me specifics? The reply came quickly. I don't want to get in trouble, but let's just say Mark has charmed more than one married woman here. HR has gotten complaints, but he's slippery. Always finds a way to make it seem consensual or deny everything. People are scared to speak out because he's tight with upper management. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as a plan began to form. If Mark had a history of this behavior, there were likely others who had stories to tell. And if Julia's coworker was right about HR brushing things under the rug, that meant there was a pattern that someone higher up wouldn't be able to ignore if it came to light. I spent the rest of the day digging. A quick search of Mark's name on social media brought up a surprisingly public profile. Scrolling through his posts, it didn't take long to find photos of him at office events, laughing and posing with various coworkers. One photo, in particular, caught my attention. Mark with his arm around another woman, a caption reading, "Team building retreat. Good times with great people." The woman looked uncomfortable, her smile forced. I clicked on her profile, and found that she still worked at Julia's company. This was my chance. I sent her a private message, keeping it professional but direct. Hi, I know this is out of the blue, but I'm reaching out because I believe Mark has a pattern of inappropriate behavior at work. If you've experienced anything or know someone who has, please let me know. I'm trying to gather information to bring this to light. Hours passed before she responded, but when she did, the floodgates opened. I've been waiting for someone to speak up about Mark. He's a predator. At the last company retreat, he cornered me after a dinner and tried to kiss me. I pushed him away, but he acted like it was no big deal. HR dismissed it as miscommunication. I've seen him do the same thing to others. It's disgusting. My anger flared, but I kept my reply measured. I asked if she'd be willing to write a formal statement. To my surprise, she agreed. Over the next few days, I contacted other people who'd interacted with Mark, building a file of testimonies and screenshots. The picture that emerged was damning. A pattern of harassment, manipulation, and cover-ups that painted Mark as a serial predator. With everything compiled, I reached out to someone higher up in Julia's company, a name I'd found on their website, the regional director. I crafted an email, attaching the evidence and outlining everything I'd uncovered. Asterisk, dear director's name. I'm writing to you as a concerned spouse and citizen. Over the past few weeks, I've uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior by one of your employees, Mark, last name. Attached are statements and evidence from several of his colleagues, detailing incidents of harassment and inappropriate conduct. I trust that as someone in your position, you'll ensure this matter is handled appropriately. If I don't see action taken, I'll have no choice but to escalate this to the media and relevant authorities. Sincerely, Daniel, last name, asterisk. I hit send, my hands trembling with adrenaline. It wasn't long before I received a response. Asterisk, dear Mr. Last name, thank you for bringing this to my attention. We take these allegations very seriously and will begin a formal investigation immediately. Please know that we are committed to maintaining a safe and respectful work environment. Sincerely, director's name, asterisk. Satisfied. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a rare sense of accomplishment. Mark's days of preying on women were numbered. But I wasn't done yet. Julia was still trying to spin her web of lies, playing the victim and reaching out to anyone who would listen. So I decided to take one final step to ensure the truth was undeniable. I posted my side of the story online, not in a bitter rant, but as a measured account of what had happened. I included screenshots of Julia's messages, the hotel photos, and the divorce papers I'd served her. I left out names to protect identities, but made it clear that I wasn't going to let her rewrite the narrative. The post gained traction quickly, with hundreds of comments pouring in. Some were supportive, others critical, but the majority were simply shocked by the audacity of it all. Man, I'm so sorry you're dealing with this. She asked for a hall pass? That's insane. Good for you for standing up for yourself. Stay strong. Julia saw the post, of course. She called me, her voice trembling with anger. You had no right to put our private life on the internet, she shouted. Funny, I replied, my voice calm. I thought you had no right to ask for a hall pass or sneak around behind my back. Guess we're both guilty of something. She hung up, but I didn't care. The damage was done, and this time, it wasn't me picking up the pieces. A week later, I got an update from Julia's coworker. Mark had been suspended pending an investigation, and rumors were swirling that his career at the company was over. As for Julia, she moved out of town shortly after our divorce was finalized, leaving behind the wreckage of her choices. And me? I'm still picking up the pieces, but for the first time in years, I feel like I'm in control of my life again. Some people might say I went too far, but I don't regret a thing. Julia and Mark thought they could walk all over me, but they forgot one simple truth. Even the softest man can grow a spine when pushed too far.